Welcome to a year of Final Fantasy. We're in the month of December, and we're talking about the Ivalice Alliance project that came from a spin-off known as Final Fantasy Tactics. And in fact, that's the game that we're going to talk about today. I know a lot of people have been waiting for this one, myself included, and like I said, this game popularized Ivalice as a setting, and many people rank this game just as high as Final Fantasy VII. And of course, we're talking about the one and only Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation, and we'll talk about the remake here in a little bit at the end of this video. So what is Final Fantasy Tactics? Well, it's one of the first spin-off games of the franchise, but it feels much more important than other spin-offs, like say Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles or something, probably because of how widely praised it is, and maybe because it's one of the first. Interestingly, this particular title of Final Fantasy Tactics wasn't technically the first game to receive that Tactics moniker. And in fact, a few years before this, there was a little-known game that we did not get over here in the United States called Bahamut Lagoon. You can go ahead and get a ROM and a fan translation of that, although I totally don't suggest you get ROMs, but I mean, that's the only way you're going to play Bahamut Lagoon. That particular game was actually titled Final Fantasy Tactics during development, but to clarify, that game has absolutely nothing to do with anything Final Fantasy. That game's name was changed to Bahamut Lagoon. And today we all have the game that we know, Final Fantasy Tactics, that is a completely 100% different game. It wasn't just shifted off and, retained some Bahamut Lagoon stuff. It's a completely different game. So, Final Fantasy Tactics was created by Yatsumi Matsuno, and the producer was none other than Hironobu Sakaguchi himself. And the game was released on PlayStation on June the 20th in 1997. And to put that into perspective about what games were coming out then, in Japan on January 31st, 1997 was Final Fantasy VII's release date, and in the US it was September 7th of that same year, 1997. So this game actually came out in the middle of the summer after Final Fantasy VII was out in Japan, but before it came out over here in the States. So that's kind of weird. So anyway, we can talk about how that game released and everything, but what makes Final Fantasy Tactics such a great game? Well, a lot of things went into the game that were well thought out, and it really does feel more than the sum of its parts. First, we have the narrative. Here we have a fascinating narrative that feels like the world is actually lived in. While most other JRPGs feels like the world was created for the story, here it just feels like Ivalice, the setting that it takes place in, is just simply a stage where we are experiencing a small story in the vast history of this very much lived in, down-to-earth, gritty kind of world. And it is very much gritty. And it's a dark game, just general themes and tones and everything. And I hate to make the comparison, but what immediately jumps to mind is the Song of Ice and Fire series, or also known as Game of Thrones for those that just watch the TV series. You're very much in a setting like that. There's a lot more magic for sure, but the same kind of family betrayals and corruption and everything like that is definitely taking place here. So if you really like that, definitely go out and try Final Fantasy Tactics. But along with the narrative, to have a narrative that is good, you gotta have some good characters. And this does have incredibly compelling characters that really do make the story shine. Our hero is Ramza, and he's a noble who starts to uncover some disheartening revelations, and it goes on and on from there. And to really push the fact that Final Fantasy Tactics is absolutely equal amongst a number of the main franchise games, this soon-to-be released Final Fantasy Dissidia NT that's going to be on the PlayStation 4, it's the Final Fantasy fighting game, Ramza is a playable character right alongside the greats like Cecil, Kain, Cloud, Squall, Zidane, etc. So the game is definitely more of a main franchise game than it is any kind of spin-off. So along with Ramza, the supporting cast are all equally as awesome with very much rich backstories, and I could do an entire year on Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm not, but you could. It's definitely a very deep game. The narrative of the game is called the Zodiac Brave story. Again, it's just one portion of the history of Ivalice, and it takes place during a period known as the War of the Lions, which actually kind of comes into play a little bit later with the remake. Complementing that narrative, though, is the mechanics, which are easily the single defining trait of this game. Specifically, I'm talking about battles, because that's quite literally all there is to this game. No longer do you wander around the world falling into random battles. Here, the entire game basically takes place in the battles, except for a world map where you kind of just point to a little node and your character will travel there. It's very much completely different than a traditional Final Fantasy game, but it does make for some incredibly rich and in-depth battles. So these battles, just kind of giving you an overview, you're presented with an area of terrain and it's shaped into a grid, and each of your characters usually have about 5, maybe 6 with a guest character. You have to navigate that terrain, play it to your advantage, and then gain the upper hand, attack, and defeat the enemies, of course. It's sort of like a game of chess. However, in the game, it's not just always about defeating your enemies. You're also going to have to save characters, and there's some different things like that. So it's not always just like kill everything. And in fact, sometimes you'll actually have the choice of either killing them or saving a character, which will affect the narrative of the game a little bit. And one of the big things about the battle system, we do have the iconic feature returning, and that is the job system of Final Fantasy. And this is possibly the most fun part about Final Fantasy Tactics. Each job is leveled up, and whenever you combine different levels of different jobs, you can have access to more advanced jobs, assuming that you meet the qualifications. And any character can switch jobs freely. Like if you're a black mage and you want to start leveling up white mage with that character, you can completely do that. Then you can, get your black mage stuff that you learned and help you out a little bit for the white mage that you're leveling up. It's really cool. The battle system is incredibly reminiscent of a tabletop RPG such as Dungeons & Dragons, and you know what? I argue that specifically 4th edition D&D is the closest anyone is ever going to get to a true Final Fantasy Tactics-like game. A lot of people hate Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, but a lot of people love Final Fantasy Tactics, and I know a few people that hate 4th edition but love Tactics, and that just doesn't mesh with me. I don't understand why, but yeah, I would say if you want to play this on tabletop, 4th edition D&D is definitely the best bet here. Several hidden things have been placed here in the game as well, and you never really see much of that these days. I don't want to give away spoilers or anything for those that haven't played the game, but you'll see some familiar faces that may appear with games that have come out around that time, and that's all I'll say about that, so it's pretty cool. And after the game release, 10 years later in 2007, Final Fantasy Tactics received a relaunch on the PSP with some upgraded cinematic scenes, actually completely new cinematic scenes, and some content that was maybe in the game beforehand, but we couldn't access it, such as the Dark Knight. You can actually be a Dark Knight in the PSP remake, remaster, whatever. And there's an Onion Knight job, kind of just a little bit of a throwback there. This version of the game, this PSP version, was called The War of the Lions. Again, there was some new cinematics. They were amazing, very well done. And alongside the jobs, there's a multiplayer mode, which is kind of neat. And the only problem really with War of the Lions, aside from all of the cool stuff that does have added to it, is there is some incredibly severe slowdown with some of the animations of the characters, and honestly, given the type of game it is, it doesn't really affect the game in any meaningful way, but it's really strange how much slowdown there is and why that slowdown even exists in the first place when we're talking about a port of the PS1, where the PSP is, as good if not better than the PS1. It's really weird, but definitely, if you want to play this game, get War of the Lions. After Final Fantasy Tactics was put out and everyone got to play it, it received overwhelming praise, even to this day. If you haven't played it, there are many different releases of the more recent War of the Lions you can get on the PSP, tablets, smartphones, iOS, whatever have you. You owe it to yourself to play this game. It's definitely one you shouldn't miss out on. It has narrative, has awesome combat. It's just something very special that you don't see often. And I'm going to do something a little bit different here, a little bit special. Since Final Fantasy Tactics is such a staple of the franchise, just as all the other games that we've talked about, we watched their opening cinematics for their proper release, Final Fantasy 1 through 15. We're going to do that here with Final Fantasy Tactics. I feel that it's only fair to treat this game in every way as a peer of its proper numbered franchise counterparts. So here it is, the opening to Final Fantasy Tactics. And as always, until next time, Mr. Warriors, keep on gaming and enjoy.